This is a case that's been bounced around back and forth throughout the court system.
Everybody has a right if they're a responsible adult.
There's a piece of legislation circulating through Florida right now that has something unprecedented happening. Elected law enforcement officials are publicly refusing to enforce it, not quietly declining, not privately expressing concerns, openly announcing on the record that they will not comply with a state mandate. 23 county sheriffs have declared they consider this new requirement a direct constitutional violation, and that number keeps growing daily. Sheriff Wayne Ivey from Brevard County went on record stating his department won't participate in any enforcement actions. Liberty County Sheriff Nick Finch took it further, announcing that any state official attempting to enforce this law in his jurisdiction will be met with resistance from his deputies. Even Polk County, with over 750,000 residents, has joined what's being called the Sheriff Rebellion. Meanwhile, Miami-Dade County, the most populated county in Florida with 2.7 million residents, remains conspicuously silent on their enforcement position, leaving gun owners in that massive area completely uncertain about their legal status. Here's what makes this situation genuinely explosive. Florida has 67 counties total, which means 44 counties are either actively enforcing this mandate or haven't clarified their position. Gun owners living on county borders are facing an impossible situation where they could be legal, driving down one side of a street and committing a misdemeanor on the other side, depending solely on which sheriff's jurisdiction they're in. The law at the center of this constitutional crisis, a mandatory firearm registration system that fundamentally contradicts everything Florida has represented for gun rights over the past 3 decades. The state that gave Americans permitless carry just 2 years ago now requires every gun owner to submit serial numbers, make and model information, and proof of purchase for every firearm they own to a centralized state database. And the deadline is October 15th. What follows is the story of how Florida went from constitutional carry champion to mandatory registration overnight, why this represents far more than just another gun control measure, and what it means for the Second Amendment when elected sheriffs openly defy state mandates they've sworn to uphold. Because this isn't just about Florida anymore. This is about whether registration inevitably leads to confiscation, and whether that pattern is about to repeat itself in America's third most populous state. The registration system nobody expected. Starting October 15th, every gun owner in Florida must register their firearms with a new state database system. This isn't a voluntary program or suggested best practice. It's mandatory, with criminal penalties for non-compliance. The requirements are comprehensive and invasive. Gun owners must submit serial numbers, complete make and model information, and proof of purchase for every firearm they own. If firearms were acquired through private sales or inherited from family members, owners must provide sworn affidavits explaining how they obtained each weapon. The registration fee is $47 per firearm. For someone owning 5 guns, that's $235 just to remain legal. A collector with 20 firearms faces nearly $1,000 in fees purely for compliance. Failure to register by the deadline results in a second-degree misdemeanor carrying up to 60 days in jail and a $500 fine. But here's the genuinely dangerous part that most gun owners are missing. This misdemeanor conviction can strip away the right to own firearms in other states with stricter requirements. What begins as a simple registration requirement becomes a potential pathway to losing Second Amendment rights entirely. Gun owners across Florida are flooding county offices trying to determine if this is even legitimate. Phone lines at sheriff's departments have been jammed for weeks, and the answers they're getting depend entirely on which county they happen to live in. When the technology fails catastrophically, the state's online registration portal crashed within 4 hours of going live and stayed completely offline for 6 consecutive days. When it finally returned to operation, gun owners discovered the system was rejecting serial numbers containing certain letters, claiming they were invalid entries. This creates an impossible situation for owners of older firearms. Guns manufactured before 1968 often have serial numbers that don't follow modern alphanumeric conventions, and the system simply won't accept them. One Jacksonville gun owner spent 3 hours on hold trying to register his grandfather's 1952 Winchester rifle, only to be told he needs to bring it to a state-approved gunsmith to have it reserialized at his own expense. That process cost between $150 and $300 per firearm, depending on location. The database also requires current photographs of each firearm, meaning owners can't simply submit registration paperwork. They need clear, well-lit photos showing serial numbers and overall condition. A collector in Tampa Tampa, who owns 47 firearms, calculated that full compliance would cost him over $2,200 in fees alone, not counting time investment or potential gunsmith costs for older weapons. The system also requires gun owners to indicate whether firearms are stored in a safe gun cabinet or other secure location at their primary residence. This level of detail creates a comprehensive map of not just who owns guns in Florida, but exactly what they own and where those firearms are stored. The data breach waiting to happen. Florida's government databases have been compromised 4 times in the last 7 years, and now the state wants to create a centralized registry of every gun owner with detailed inventories of exactly what they possess. In 2019, the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles suffered a breach exposing personal information of 8.6 million drivers. 2 years later, the unemployment system was hacked during pandemic response efforts, compromising social security numbers and banking details for 1.2 million residents. The state's response to these breaches has consistently been offering free credit monitoring, a solution that does absolutely nothing if criminals obtain names, addresses, and detailed inventories of firearms stored at specific locations. Criminals could systematically target homes based on the number and type of registered firearms, and there's already documented evidence this happens in states with similar registry systems. California's firearms database has been subpoenaed 37 times by attorneys in civil litigation cases, meaning firearms information could become part of public court records if owners are ever involved in any lawsuit, even ones completely unrelated to firearms. The security risks aren't theoretical. They're documented, repeated, and inevitable given Florida's track record with database protection. The constitutional battle beginning. The Second Amendment Foundation filed a federal lawsuit exactly 9 days after this mandate was announced. They're not alone. Florida Carry, Inc., Gun Owners of America, and the Firearms Policy Coalition have all joined with separate legal challenges targeting different aspects of the law. The core constitutional argument is straightforward but powerful. The Supreme Court ruled in District of Columbia versus Heller that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. Requiring registration before exercising that right is constitutionally identical to requiring permits before speaking freely or attending religious services. Imagine needing government permission and paying fees to post on social media or attend a protest. The principle is the same. Legal scholars are pointing to a lesser-known 1968 case, Haynes v. United States, where the Supreme Court ruled that forcing someone to register a firearm could violate Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. The court found that requiring registration created situations where compliance with the law could provide evidence of illegal possession. Florida's mandate has identical constitutional problems, yet nobody in the state legislature apparently read that precedent before drafting this law. The compliance trap with no good options. Gun owners who register create a permanent paper trail that could create legal liability for decades. Those who refuse registration risk criminal charges. This is the textbook definition of a no-win situation. If owners comply and register everything, they're admitting under penalty of perjury that they possess specific firearms at specific locations. If any registered firearms are later used in crimes because they were stolen, or if owners sell guns privately and forget to update the registry, they could face charges for filing false information. The law requires updating registration within 10 days of any change in ownership or storage location. Forget to file that update when moving houses, and owners are technically in violation. Criminal penalties attached to that failure. On the other hand, if owners refuse to register and their county is actively enforcing the mandate, they're committing crimes just by possessing unregistered firearms. Traffic stops become potential misdemeanor investigations if officers run names and discover non-compliance with registration requirements. The system is designed so that every option carries legal risk. Compliance creates permanent government records of firearms ownership. Non-compliance creates criminal liability. There's no neutral position. The historical pattern that keeps repeating. Registration has historically been the first step toward confiscation, and documented patterns prove this progression repeats itself consistently. New York passed the SAFE Act in 2013, requiring registration of certain rifles. Within 5 years, the state began sending confiscation letters to gun owners who had registered during that initial period. California has used their registry to reclassify firearms multiple times, suddenly making previously legal guns illegal and demanding owners either surrender them or face felony charges. The registry made enforcement of retroactive bans possible. Canada implemented long gun registration in 1995, explicitly promising it would never lead to confiscation. Then in 2020, they banned over 1,500 models of firearms and used those registration records to identify and contact owners for mandatory buybacks. The registration data made comprehensive confiscation logistically feasible. The pattern is consistent across jurisdictions and time periods. Registration enables future restrictions that would be impossible to enforce without comprehensive ownership records. The legislative process that bypassed debate. This mandatory registration appeared suddenly with almost no public debate, legislative hearings, or expert testimony. The timeline alone reveals how abnormal this process was. The bill was introduced on a Friday afternoon, passed through committee on Monday, reached the floor on Wednesday, and was signed into law by Thursday evening. That's a 5-day turnaround for legislation that fundamentally changes gun ownership in America's third most populous state. No testimony was heard from gun rights organizations or constitutional scholars. The standard process of public comment, debate, and amendment was completely bypassed, using an emergency provision supposedly reserved for natural disasters and immediate threats to public safety. No emergency was identified or articulated that would justify this accelerated timeline. The legislation moved so quickly that many Florida gun owners didn't even know it existed until after it had already become law. By the time awareness spread through gun owner communities, the bill had already been signed and implementation was underway. The sheriffs drawing constitutional lines. 23 sheriffs have publicly announced they will not enforce this registration mandate, with more joining daily. These aren't fringe figures or political outsiders. They're elected law enforcement officials taking public stands that their oath to the Constitution supersedes state legislative mandates they consider unconstitutional. This creates unprecedented legal uncertainty. In counties where sheriffs refuse enforcement, gun owners face minimal practical risk of prosecution for non-compliance. In counties where sheriffs remain silent or support enforcement, identical gun owners committing identical actions face potential misdemeanor charges. The lack of uniform statewide enforcement means legal status depends entirely on geographic location within Florida. Residents near county borders face absurd situations where legality changes based on which side of a jurisdictional line they happen to be on at any given moment. So here's the reality unfolding in Florida right now. A state that championed constitutional carry just 2 years ago has implemented mandatory registration that 23 sheriffs are openly refusing to enforce. A database system that crashed immediately and rejects older firearms serial numbers. Registration fees that could cost collectors thousands of dollars. And criminal penalties for non-compliance that could strip away Second Amendment rights in other states. The constitutional challenges are mounting. The sheriff's rebellion is growing. And millions of Florida gun owners are trapped in legal limbo, unsure whether compliance creates permanent government records that enable future confiscation or non-compliance creates criminal records that strip away rights immediately. This isn't just about Florida. This is about whether registration inevitably enables confiscation, whether sheriffs can constitutionally refuse to enforce laws they consider unconstitutional, and whether the Second Amendment means anything when states can simply require permission slips and government databases before citizens can exercise fundamental rights. The deadline is October 15th. The lawsuits are filed, the sheriffs have drawn their lines, and what happens next in Florida will determine whether other states follow this pattern or whether constitutional challenges stop this registration scheme before it becomes the template for nationwide gun control. The stakes have never been higher, and the outcome remains completely uncertain.